Ladies and gentlemen, please give a wonderful welcome to Michael Lewis, who'll be interviewed by Mark Zandi.
Good evening. I want to thank Andy and the Free Library for the opportunity to be here with such a great author. Admired your work for, how many years have you been writing books now?
Liar's Poker was published in end of 89.
89?
Yeah.
Right, so.
You can do the math.
Trying. I should apologize. I have a cold, so if I start sneezing or going to my pocket, sorry. I didn't shake anyone's hand, though. So I understand you've had a pretty busy day.
So the book came out Tuesday, and I started the tour Monday, it's the famous line about book tours is it's like running for president but without the sex, and it does feel that way. That you do. That a political person, it actually interested me when I was covering the '96 presidential campaign, that these people could go out there on the road and say the same thing over and over and over and actually gather conviction as they were doing it. When I say it's the same thing 4 times, I'm sure I'm a fraud. So you have this, the book tours are very good at killing your own interest in your book. And from the point of view of the publisher who's looking for more books and different material, it's really useful because I've got to go find something else to think about.
So this is week 1 of
this
the book
is
tour.
day 5, right?
Day 5. And so how long is the tour? How long are you going for?
It goes for another 8 days up to Christmas, and then I go to London. I go to Europe next week, and then Christmas break, and then I do the West Coast for another 10 days.
Oh, so you're going to be busy.
It's not that. Yeah. It's really not. It's actually, here's the truth. This is the truth of this kind of experience. Is that when you write a book, you're sitting alone for a long time, and you're listening for years. This was an 8-year project. Nobody I was interviewing was asking me questions about myself. I was saying, I was on the receipt, I was in your seat. And then I was in a seat in my office, all by myself, with headphones on, shutting the world out. And to go from that to the Colbert Report, or the Colbert Show, or to Morning Joe, or to any of this stuff, it's an insane making experience. Right. It's a jolt when you're all of a sudden on stage, when you kind of come out of your office and you got to talk about the thing. Plus, the added wrinkle is that at least when I'm working on a book, the last thing I want to do is talk about the book, because I've been thinking about it all day. When people ask me what I'm doing, I dream up a line or two about the book that just kills their interest. So let me tell you, I'm writing a book about baseball statistics. No one asked a follow-up question. I'm writing a book about 2 Israeli psychologists. That was a conversation killer. Nobody wanted to know. They thought I'd lost my mind. And then you got to flip and be not only on stage but engaging about it, and actually try to interest people and like fan conversation about it. It is a real flip. And then what happens, since you asked, then what happens is after 3 or 4 days, you get used to it. And I don't know, anybody ever see the movie Lawrence of Arabia?
Oh, yeah.
All right. You remember when there's that really emotional, wonderful scene when he comes back from his first slaughter of Turks, and he goes in to see the general, and he can't talk. He won't speak, and the general thinks he's traumatized by the battle. And Peter O'Toole Lawrence keeps saying, you don't understand, you don't understand. And he says, you don't understand, I liked it. And I feel that way about publicity. That after 4 or 5 days, I'm actually traumatized because I'm starting to enjoy this. And then the last station of this little exercise is you go home to your wife and children, and you can't understand why they're not sitting down there listening to you. It's the most amazing thing, how they could give a rat's ass what you say or think or have done in the last 3 weeks. And you have to come out of, having gone through the misery of going into this process, you have to come out of it. Right. And so that's a book tour, and in a nutshell. And there's no getting around it. You got to go talk about the book if anybody's going to read the book.
Well, you already seem a little punchy to me, so good luck.
Give me 20 minutes.
That's right. Good luck with this.
Yeah.
Right.
You
So-
too, man.
Yeah, yeah.
You're
So-
implicated
yeah.
here. Don't no. This
Yeah.
whole "I got a cold and I'm not here"
I-
thing.
well-
That's not gonna fly. That you're like, whatever happens
Hey,
here.
This group
you're
knows me. I've done this a
responsible.
few times.
All right,
I've done
all
this a few times.
All right.
So the book. The
Yep.
book.
Yep.
And speaking as an economist, what possessed you to write about two economists?
They're not economists. They're psychologists.
Okay, there you go. That explains it.
There you go. See? There's a man who's prepared for the job. There you go. So,
Well, no, wait. In all fairness, the guy
in all
won.
fairness to myself.
No. The guy won the Nobel Prize in economics.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, that's interesting.
Okay. All right. Yeah.
That's
all
why
right.
it's interesting. He
I
was-
consider him to be an economist. I'll take him. Yeah.
You're the only one on the planet who considers him to be an economist. Is that like I feel like he's an economist, so he must be an economist? He is a psychologist who hardly knows any economics, who blew a hole in the side of economics, and they had to give it to him because he had the effect on the discipline. But no, he's not an economist, and is unlike an economist as anyone I've ever met, actually. But you know what?
I don't know. You're talking about Kahneman.
Yeah.
He feels
Tversky.
very economics to me, like an economist to me. He acts like an economist. No, he doesn't.
No.
Okay.
No, he's so unsure of himself for a start.
That's every economist. They act with confidence. Well, I guess he doesn't.
He doesn't.
Although Tversky did.
Tversky was very much
Yeah.
like an economist. Now, Tversky, I think, in a different era, would have been an economist or a physicist or something less wishy-washy than a psychologist.
Right.
He became a psychologist
Right.
by accident,
Right.
and the accident was that there was no psychology department at Hebrew University until the year he applied to go to Hebrew University. And Israel without a psychology department is a bit like Alabama without a football team. That everybody in the country wanted to be a psychologist, and then they open up this department. They have lines around the block to get into it, literally lines around the block, and there are only 20 spots. And so it was the most selective department in the university. And Tversky was just like pathologically competitive, and he saw it and he thought, I want to get into it. And I think that's how it starts. But his mind, economists recognized Amos's mind. They didn't recognize Danny's mind.
So why did you write the book? Why these characters? Why this book?
It was all the books I've written have got this huge accidental component to them. I didn't go looking for a book. What happened was I published my book about baseball, Moneyball, the book about baseball statistics. And it wasn't really about baseball statistics. What it really was about was how the market for baseball players, for professional baseball players, makes such huge mistakes, like how baseball players get misjudged. And with the implication being that if these people who are, very highly paid and closely evaluated employees of this industry can be misvalued, who can't be? I didn't think much while I was writing about the book about why the market for baseball players was screwed up. I mean, that why the scouts made misjudgments, why the Oakland A's, when they started to avail themselves of advanced analytics, when they started to use data to evaluate the players rather than the opinions of their scouts, why that gave them an advantage. When the book came out, it was reviewed by an economist and a legal scholar named Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein. And they reviewed it in the New Republic, and they said they liked the story kind of thing, but Mr. Lewis seems not to realize that two Israeli psychologists did the work that explains why this market is screwed up and why people, when they look at other people, misjudge them so dramatically as was going on in baseball. And I never heard of these guys. I thought, oh my God, I missed the story. Mm-hmm. And I thought that it was kind of in the back of my mind bothering me for a couple of years. Mm-hmm. And I have a drinking buddy in Berkeley. So there are about 6 accidents in this. Uh-huh. This is the first. I have a drinking buddy in Berkeley who
We're going to get 6 of them?
6 accidents.
You're going to give us 6 accidents.
Yeah, in this story. You're not going to have to actually think any more about the book. I'll do the rest.
Right.
All right.
He's going to give us 6. Okay.
I'll just take this. All right. I got this.
Yeah, go ahead.
I got this. If you need to blow your nose.
Actually, give me a little bit of time, just a little bit.
Okay. All right. Let me just. So my drinking buddy is a professor of psychology at Cal. His name is Dacher Keltner. Most recent book was called The Power Paradox. He is a really interesting guy. His field is emotion. He was the technical advisor on a movie called Inside Out that Pixar brought out. He's redesigned the emojis at Facebook and Twitter, and so that the actual emojis are more accurately representative of the emotion. But he was Amos Tversky's teaching assistant. And I told him finally one day, it's bothered me that I missed this trick in Moneyball, and that there were these guys who actually could have enriched the book. And he said, well, Amos is dead. He died in 1996, but Danny Kahneman lives up the hill. He's got a house. He had a house half a mile from mine, and he was there only in the summers. He was there, and he said, I'm friends with him. I can introduce you. And for some reason, I thought, Danny must have been the first Nobel Prize winner I've ever met. But I somehow thought that I wasn't worthy of meeting a Nobel Prize winner. I thought, he's going to make time for me? And he said, sure, it's not a problem. So I went up. Danny invited me up to his house. And a conversation began. This was, by then, we were in late 2007. And Danny was then working on a book that became Thinking Fast and Slow, which has sold approximately 9 billion copies. And Danny was, from the moment I encountered him, tortured. Like, the conversation was instantly about this horrible book he was writing. He said, "This is terrible. It's going to destroy my reputation. The publisher, seduced me into writing this thing. I really shouldn't be writing it. Here's some of it. Tell me why I shouldn't publish it." And it turned out he was doing this with a lot of people. In fact, he had paid a friend $5,000 to distribute the $5,000 to people he didn't know, but who were experts in the field, to write harsh reviews of his manuscript to persuade him not to publish it. So my job in Danny's life was to supply confidence and buck him up and tell him that it was actually quite good, because it was. And in the course of doing this, so he took an interest in me because I was bucking him up and looking at his book and stuff. And we take long walks in the Berkeley Hills, and he started to tell me the story of his relation, not as a story, but he'd tell me little anecdotes about him and Amos. And it became quite clear after a while that I was listening to a man describe the most important relationship in his life, and it was a love story. And it also became clear, as I kind of dug into their work, that it had touched many spheres of human activity, not just sports. Medicine had been affected. Wall Street had been affected. They'd had a lot of influence that had not been completely pointed out. And so then I started to get interested in it as material. And it took a couple of years of kind of noodling around with it. And now we're in 2009, 2010, and I wrote The Big Short, Boomerang, and Flash Boys while I was working on this too. But I made trips to Israel. I'd see Danny whenever he was in town. Oh, so the next accident, big accident.
Is this number 2?
This is 4. 3.
Oh, thank you.
This is 3. Okay. So number 3. So as I say, you can just relax.
Yeah. I've got a few tough questions if you let me answer.
So you're really not going to get to those.
Yeah.
And I taught for a year at Cal, and about my favorite student was a kid named Oren Tversky, who happens to have been Amos's oldest child. Huh. And we had a relationship. We go to dinner once a year, and I'd kind of follow him his way as he made his way in the world, and I just thought he was this great guy. But he was kind of a kid. And I then made the connection, and Oren said, we haven't really encouraged anybody to write about Dad, just as Danny had not encouraged anybody to write about him. But if it's you, I'll introduce you to my mom and tell her you're not a monster. And so Barbara Tversky, Amos's widow, opened up a treasure trove of files for me. Amos died in 1996, and the filing cabinets that he had with all his notes and papers and stuff in at the Stanford Psychology Department are still in the hallway where he left them. There's this thing about Amos. He's a secular saint. Everything became a relic after he died. All this stuff is there. And so I had access. So that's maybe the end of the real accidents. But from that point, I had access to a story that I could see was a big story. And then the big problem was summoning the nerve to write it, because I had a field I knew nothing about, psychology, and a backdrop, a setting, Israel in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, that not only did I not know much about, but I thought it was a kind of subject you kind of need to be licensed to write about, I thought. I'm like a happy goy from New Orleans. It's not what you do. That isn't who you would typically think would be painting a picture of Israel after the Holocaust. And so I thought I had a problem. And it took me a long time before I said, what happened was, it became clear that nobody's going to do it, because Danny wouldn't let anybody do it, and the Tversky family weren't going to let anybody do it if I didn't do it. And I said to Danny finally, I said, someone will do it badly. They won't have access. The relationship's too important, and people are going to appreciate the importance of it. So someone will do it badly, probably after you're dead. So you might as well let me do it badly. And he said, you're right, you're probably going to do it badly, but you might as well be you. And then they were off.
Great. So correct me if I'm wrong, and I know you will.
Oh, do you feel I'm being harsh on you?
No, you're my buddy.
We got a vibe. No.
So I think the core idea, their core idea, was that the human being can't get probabilities right. That their intuition about probabilities and statistics more broadly is just wrong.
That's one of their ideas. I wouldn't even say it's their core idea.
You wouldn't, okay.
No. But it is one of their important ideas, I agree.
Okay, so what do you think their core ideas?
There's so many nuggets, because they move from judgment to decision making, and they have all this stuff they do that they don't even publish about exploring the rules of the
Core ideas can be
imagination.
stated in 2 to 3 sentences.
Yes,
Yeah.
human fallibility.
Human fallibility.
That we're wired for it.
Right.
We're wired to do things that we probably shouldn't do, and that it's a byproduct of a mechanism that basically works okay. And if we know how we're fallible, we can maybe check it.
But the fallibility is all centered around probabilities and statistics, isn't it? Loss aversion, regression to the mean.
Not all of it.
No, not all of it?
Not all of it. So framing effects.
Yeah.
That's them. Framing effect.
That affects your perception of probability, depending on what your frame is, right?
Well, no. So what I mean by that is that people are responding to descriptions of things rather than things themselves. You tell as they did, a doctor that the patient has terminal cancer, and but there's this experimental operation they can do right now.
Right.
Problem is a 10% chance the patient will die on the table. They are half as likely to actually do the operation than if you tell them there's a 90% chance the patient will survive. Same thing. You just describe one as a loss and one as a gain. This exaggerated their insight that people were extremely sensitive to losses, much more sensitive to losses than to gains. That when people were making decisions between gambles, that they were really sensitive to changes in states of wealth rather than absolute states of wealth. They had a whole passage of a year where they were doing nothing but studying or thinking about the role of regret in decision making, like how people anticipate regret and whether they build that into some advanced calculation. So it wasn't all just getting probabilities wrong, or it wasn't even the getting probabilities wrong, is that they don't even do a probabilistic calculation, that they tell a story instead. So that's the judgment work, that's right. But the decision making work's a little different, and then there's other stuff that are kind of tailings from their works. Danny's happiness work, right? The work that they did that showed that people, what the happiness people expect from some event differs from what they actually experience, which differs again from what they remember, and that you can manipulate, for example, the colonoscopy study.
Yeah, I read that. Yeah.
So that it's. I told that to my doctor at a colonoscopy 3 weeks ago.
Yeah.
And he didn't really want to hear about it because in the middle of the operation, apparently I looked up and I'd said, you know, in that drug-induced
Yeah.
state, when you were a little boy, did you think you were going to be doing this for the rest of your life? And so he wasn't all that interested in my book when I came out of I came out of it.
So let me ask you a question. So, okay, so I guess I'm the economist, so I'm focused on the things that matter to me, the economist, and it's a lot of their work on behavioral economics, and they're the fathers of, or thought to be the fathers of behavioral economics, centers around the fallacies that people have with regard to a probability of events and how they manage around that.
Yeah, that's the part of them you would see. 'Cause
That's
you're an
that's the
economist.
part that I
Right.
focus on.
Right.
And I think very valuable because the work they did in the 70s was also a period when the predominant economic theory was known as rational expectation, so that we are rational beings. Even our expectations about the future are indeed rational, which sounds weird on the face of it, right? Okay, how can that possibly be true?
Yeah.
You know, we're definitely not rational.
Right.
So
How can, if the government cuts taxes, people automatically make a calculation that they
can offset it.
They can offset
Yeah.
in their personal
Right.
finances what's going to happen when the government needs to.
So they were clearly a counterweight. The counterweight came maybe 2 decades later. It wasn't the counterweight in the 1970s. And actually, the guy who did rational expectations, Robert Lucas, got a Nobel Prize for that theory as well. But the question is, what if you believe in the theory of evolution, and I assume you believe in the theory of evolution?
Not like a religious doctrine, but
No,
but
yeah,
it makes
but
sense.
as a
Makes
scientific,
a lot, makes sense.
Yeah. What do you think this inherent inability to assess risk and probabilities, how does that fit in the theory? What is
What's going on there?
Yeah, what's going on there?
Why was it not ground out of us by
Exactly.
the wheels of
Yeah.
evolution?
Right.
It is an interesting question that they never even tried to answer.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
they just didn't. They
Yeah.
said, however this happened, we don't know how it happened. We're just showing you how it works.
Right.
And
any intuition? I mean,
well, Amos.
what's your gut say? Sorry.
Well, Amos would
Inside
say,
joke.
Amos had two things to say
Yeah.
to evolutionary
Yeah.
psychologists. One is, the more I listen to evolutionary psychologists talk, the less I believe in evolution. Because the idea that we're like perfectly evolved for the environment we happen to find ourselves in now, it seems unlikely. But his general view of the human mind was as kind of like a Swiss Army knife, that it's not exactly suited to any task, but good enough for most. And these stories, the judgmental heuristics it uses, exaggerating, the recent events, exaggerating the importance of vivid events, the thinking in stereotypes, all this, had great use value in a very crude way. But it does lead to the mistakes. Maybe another way to answer the question is to turn it on its head and say, how would the guy in the jungle have any need for advanced statistics?
Well, it's more than that, though, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm assessing risk,
Right.
And I'm assessing, and what they're saying, and what we've learned, is we assess risk wrong,
Right.
Especially under duress.
Right. And the field of statistics is fairly new, right? So we didn't. Maybe we're all evolving now in response to the knowledge we have. In 1,000 or billion years, we're all going to be Nate Silver.
Right.
Right.
That would have been my answer.
That's
that we're still evolving.
Yes, it's the man. Nate Silver is the human of the future.
Right. Yeah.
And so that's it. We're just now we can see where we're heading.
Or we get a device in our hand that
will do it for us.
Right?
Yeah.
Which is what's literally what's happening in basketball and baseball.
Yeah.
Right? Because we're overcoming that problem because even in discrimination in the workplace, right? So, I thought I was a very progressive guy and I was paying everyone equally, and we have a firm come in and they have a model, and the model says, oh, you're not.
That's interesting.
You're discriminating. And I go, how's that possible? How are we discriminating?
Right.
And they showed the results, and you know what? We need to fix this. And
who were you underpaying?
Women. Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I go, I can't believe this.
Yeah. But at least you did it, right? At least you had the sense to have someone come in.
And that's between me and you, right?
It's all. This is all really private.
Right.
Yeah. No one's
Right.
going to talk
No,
about this.
so now we're getting the models are helping
Right.
overcome that
Right.
issue.
This is absolutely right.
Yeah. So let me ask you a question.
That's what you're here for.
Yeah.
Okay.
It
Yeah,
is.
yeah.
Another question.
Okay.
So these guys, they come up with a bunch of, I should say it in a more nice way. They come up with a series of, you call them heuristics. They're kind of like rules of thumb.
Rules of thumb the mind
Rules
uses.
of thumb. And
But even they knew that what they were doing was kind of messy. They were finding all this stuff, then they were trying to jam it into a theory.
Right.
But they found stuff they couldn't jam into the theory. Anchoring.
Right.
Like they would. The experiments are incredibly creative. That you create a wheel of fortune with 100 numbers on it, 1 through 100, and you get you get your lab rats to spin it, and then after they've spun it and it lands on a number, you ask them what's the percentage of the countries in the United Nations that come from Africa, and if they've spun 92, they answer a much higher percentage than if they spun 12. That you can anchor someone in an answer with just a totally irrelevant piece of information.
Right.
You know, it's one thing to say that there are like 3 million illegal votes or 3 million instances of voter fraud in America after the last presidential election. That's at least connected to what to what you're talking about.
Right.
But you can just like say a billion, and all of a sudden it's going to affect the calculation that comes after that.
Right.
So they didn't know what to do with that.
Right.
They in the end didn't even write it up.
Right.
Because it didn't fit in what's the rule of thumb, you know?
Yeah.
But they were finding all this stuff just by thinking about how humans are. But yes, anyway, I think you were asking a question.
You know,
but
that's
I think
good.
I interrupted you.
I can't go through all of them, but I mentioned a few, and we don't have to go through defining them because they're nicely done in the book. But things like loss aversion, regression, reversion to the mean, law of small numbers, availability. These are all,
Things you would get in a basic statistics class.
yeah. So of all of those heuristics, which in your mind is the single most important in terms of its influence on real life, in terms of, it could be medicine, it could be economics, it could be whatever.
So they wouldn't call those heuristics. The things they call heuristics were the availability and the representativeness heuristic.
Okay.
And then they had some others that they kind of chucked in the end. But they gave fancy, incomprehensible names to things because they were writing for academic journals, and it gave them a kind of mystique. But what they meant was memory and similarity judgments. So they explored the many ways that what came to mind, the ease with which something came to mind did not necessarily correlate with any probability. So, you know, if you give people a passage of 2,000 words of English prose and ask them after they've read it, how many words started with the letter K versus how many words had K in the third position in the word. Everybody can remember the letters that start with the words that start with the letter K. They can't remember K in the third position, so they exaggerate their estimates of the first, and they miss they come in low on the second. And actually K appears more often in the third position in the English language in words than in the first. So they did things like so memory was one of them, but I don't know which was more important, but if I had to pick, I'd pick the other ones, representativeness. And that's this whole notion that as you move through the world making probabilistic judgments like, is that going to be a good baseball player? You're essentially doing a matching thing where you're judging the similarity between some idea, model in your head of what a good baseball player is and that thing you're looking at. And it's another way of saying you're thinking in stereotypes, especially with people. But you're thinking in types, classifications, and how people make these similarity judgments was the subject of a really interesting paper by Amos. But they spun a whole heuristic out of this. This is what people are doing is they're defaulting to stereotypes. And that, I think that's of the two heuristics, that's the most interesting. And they had all kinds of clever ways of showing that people would make actual mistakes with problems because they thought in stereotypes. Anyway.
Right. So to me, the one that kind of struck home the most was the regression to the mean.
Ooh, well, they don't think of that as a heuristic, but it's a mistake. It's a statistical concept people do not recognize in the world, but it's there all over the place.
Right.
And Danny, I agree with, it's one of the most poignant examples of the way Danny Kahneman's mind worked. that he was helping to train Israeli fighter pilots. And the way he helped to train them was to try to help train the instructors how to train them. Because he didn't know anything about flying an airplane, but he knew about how to teach people things. And he was out with them, and the instructors would all say that, when we're dealing with these young men who are becoming our fighter pilots, who were kind of the cream of the society in a lot of ways, praise is useless, criticism is what works. And Danny says, "Oh, why is that?" He says, "Well, we've noticed that whenever a pilot makes an especially spectacular maneuver and we praise him, the next maneuver is not as good. He's like resting on his laurels. And whenever he makes a particularly bad maneuver and we criticize him, he tends to get a little better."
Right.
And Danny said, "Well, actually, what's going on there is that there is a kind of mean level of performance, and you're picking out things that are off the mean, and there's a natural tendency to revert to the mean the next time. And what you're observing is just an illusion." And Danny then takes the next step and says, all teachers in the world, and parents and whatever, coaches, are getting this false feedback that their praise doesn't work and their criticism doesn't, because they direct the praise to extraordinary episodes of a performance and the criticism to extraordinarily bad performance. It is a really interesting observation when he wove it into his book, into Thinking Fast and Slow. But when he was talking to me about it early in our relationship, I coach all my kids. I changed the way I coached. I realized that I had the same feelings that the Israeli flight instructors had, that I saw an effect after criticism that I didn't see after praise. And I thought that was just dumb, So now when I coach them, I make sure I say three things. Three good things. They get three items of praise before they get criticism. And that's the worst ratio. And if you watch really smart coaches, like Steve Kerr at the Warriors, you see that actually criticism to be effective really has to be very artfully applied and very carefully applied in an environment where the person who you're trying to teach or coach comes to trust you because they get on the receiving end of the praise first. So anyway, I was just thinking that's one little example, like the practical consequences of it. And you're right that the way people miss regression effects is amazing. Really, really smart people will just not notice that what's going on is a regression effect.
Well, I guess it also goes to the idea that you can have a hot hand in basketball, and that's just
Amos,
randomness.
isn't it kind of amazing that Amos Tversky, Israeli, 5'5" Israeli, or 5'6" Israeli, shows up on our shores and is watching basketball games and hearing NBA announcers say, "Oh, he's hot. He's got the hot hand. He's just made the last 4 buckets." And Amos shows that one of their pet peeves or one of their fun subjects was the way people have a stereotype in their head of randomness itself, what randomness looks like. And they think that randomness has fewer patterns in it than it actually does. And yes, a much better shooter is likely to make more shots in a row than a really bad shooter, but you can explain streak shooting as a pattern in a random sequence of events. And he wrote a paper. He wrote a paper that had the NBA commissioner calling to holler at him. And the myth of the hot hand.
Because the commissioner didn't believe.
Yeah, they thought he was making the announcers look stupid.
Oh, I see.
And then they wanted to argue. Now, that paper is now, all these geeks who run NBA teams now know that paper. And they tell their coaches, don't get wrapped up in the idea that, your guy's hot.
Right.
But just because he made the last 4 shots, don't encourage him to take the 5th.
Right.
That's Amos originally.
Yeah.
That's another. You're right. That's another statistical illusion. And people, for whatever reason, it is an interesting question why we're wired this way.
Right.
Why is it that we don't understand that some patterns are false patterns or are meaningless patterns?
Well, it's almost you can explain the financial crisis to some degree by this, right?
Try that, because I could use that going forward on the book tour.
Okay.
Because I keep getting asked that, and I keep coming up short.
Well, because if house prices rise 10% for 1 year, and then they rise 10% for a second year, people have 2 data points and they draw a line.
Yeah.
And then if you get a third year of 10%,
Yeah.
then you've got a very strong line, and
Yep.
you believe that house prices are going to rise 10% forever.
Right.
And if you believe they're going to rise 10% forever, you do, as a borrower and as a lender, very stupid things.
Yes,
as
you
we
do.
can see.
Yeah, because you don't care whether the money would be paid back if housing prices don't go up, because you're assuming they're going to go up.
Well,
The house
they're
bails
never
you out.
going to default
Right,
because
right.
the price is going to rise.
Right.
So to me, that is the fundamental reason for the crisis is because, and then of course it became self-reinforcing, because prices were strong,
Right.
credit quality is good, lenders extend more credit, that it juices up demand, you get even higher, so you get into this self-reinforcing cycle. But fundamentally, it's the psychology of all of that created the fodder for the bubble that occurred.
That's good. If I steal that on a TV show
Yeah.
next week, are you going to
Yeah.
call in and say I just stole it?
No.
Okay.
It's between me and you.
Okay.
Yeah,
That's
just
good.
like everything else.
You're going to
on
see this
stage.
as if it were
Yeah.
original from me
Yeah, okay.
in about
Yeah. Very good.
48 hours.
Yeah.
Yeah. Monday morning
Someone's
on
going to call you
Morning
an
Joe.
idiot, like they call me all the time an idiot. So, so you can count on that. So let me ask you, well, I won't say that. Another question. Which would you rather have doing economic policy? An economist that is, or let me ask it differently. Which would you rather have doing economic policy? A president that does it based on intuition, or a president that is based on model data? What do you think?
I would like a president who has one hand on data.
One hand on
And that he's and an awareness that he needs a check on his judgment, and he doesn't think he's infallible.
Right.
That's what I like.
Right.
We're not. I wasn't referring to anybody in specific.
No, I wasn't either.
That was just.
Yeah.
We were just talking.
We are in Philadelphia.
We're just talking.
Yeah.
Right.
San Francisco, Philadelphia.
Yeah.
San Francisco, Philadelphia. Yeah. Right.
The difference between the I'm infallible approach and I've always got to kind of be watching how I make decisions approach is really interesting. We have a president now. We have the two extremes side by side. I don't think there's ever been a president who has a greater sense of, who has internalized Kahneman, Tversky's ideas, even if he hasn't read the papers. Although when I met Obama, he had Danny's book on his desk.
Oh, he did?
Yes, he did.
Yeah.
But he,
You're not making that up.
No,
He actually had the book on the
It was
desk.
on the desk of Air Force One. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
And he, this is a guy who got rid of all his suits except for the blue suits and the gray suits because he had research that showed that the more decisions you have to make in a day, the more your decision making really is corroded. And so you don't want to wear this. You don't have to think about what clothes you're putting on in the morning or what you order to eat, and that you.
I sympathize with that. Yeah.
Yeah. And he's right, he's right. If you go into Costco and you have 3 things you think you want to buy, and you're looking at all this stuff and making decisions, you end up with 6 tons of sticky buns.
Yeah.
You walk out, you come out with a completely different thing than you planned going in because your mind just gets destroyed by the range of decisions that need to be made.
So don't you think there's a middle ground, though? I mean, maybe you're saying this, that there's room for both?
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay.
So the opening chapter of the book is set in the Houston Rockets front office where they are. They tried at first to kind of give themselves over entirely to the analytic approach to decision making, and then realized that actually you can't quite do that. And even if you insisted on doing that, social pressures force you to do it differently because when you're in an inherently uncertain world, making inherently probabilistic decisions. Some of those decisions are not going to work out. Even if the process was perfect, you're going to have the outcome's not going to always be. You can't control it. The president's going to be wrong a lot, even if he's perfect, even if his process is perfect. And basketball GM is going to be wrong in who he selects in the NBA draft, even if his process is as good as it could be. And so then what happens is after you've made mistakes with your algorithm, everybody says, "Oh no, you got to let some judgment back in. We've only let the experts in." So there's social pressure to never quite go all in and with one way. Mm-hmm. But in addition, there's information that you just lack sometimes in the algorithm. I mean, if you have an algorithm for predicting the future performance of college basketball players, and even if it's perfect, it would be nice to know if the guy you're about to draft just got hit by a bus, you know, or if he's developed a sudden taste for cocaine, or whatever. There's information that the algorithm doesn't. So you need people out there gathering, sniffing around, looking for information. So you don't be idiotic about it. But the nice thing of what the boom in the data revolution has done so nicely is it's at least given us an alternative to just trust in an expert's gut, and given us a check on how the gut performs. So you can say, like, all right, you're so good at predicting who's going to be an NBA player. Let's analyze your past picks and see how you did. And the Houston Rockets do that, and they find that absolutely nobody in the NBA has exhibited any particular talent for identifying future NBA stars, and none of their scouts have either, even though they're all smart, wonderful people.
And the models are working. The
models are better.
They are
better. Yes.
They're proving that.
Yes.
Yeah, right.
And but that much better,
Yeah.
you know.
Right.
And so anyway, so we're going from an environment, a decision-making environment at the top of our country that is as close to the bleeding edge of the analytics movement as likely to get into the White House for a while, to Neanderthal man, and who is going to I'm feeling it, man, and roll the bones, and. That has not actually worked out that well for him generally. You know, there's a lot of failure in the past. But he'll be right some of the times, right? Yep. You know, and he'll be right some of the times, and people. It's wonderful to watch people impose a pattern on Trump's behavior. Yeah. Because it's like there are all these great stories being woven about the strategic brilliance and how we had it all lined up and all that. That's
the book.
That's the book.
That's
my
book.
book. It's that people impose patterns on whatever happens.
That's the book.
Because they actually can't get their mind around what's actually happening, which is insane. Yeah. It is insane. Yeah, it's insane. And we have to preserve that sense of the insanity of it and watch with maybe comic detachment for a while until something really awful.
Okay. So since the beginning of mankind, people have been making mistakes. So why did it take these two protagonists so long to figure this out?
Why were they so slow? That's pretty good. How come you didn't do it earlier? Yes. So, this is maybe another way to put the question is why did it take them? You know, why did it happen then? This is doing exactly what I said you shouldn't do, imposing a pattern on events. But here's an idea that why them? Why them and why there? Jews historically, Jews especially after the Holocaust and the birth of the Israeli state, took an understandable special interest in human judgment and decision-making. Danny's father looked at Hitler and said, this isn't a problem. We can stay in France because I saw the Germans in World War I, and there'll be a war, but nobody's going to do anything that bad at the end of the war. And that anti-Semitic talk, you can kind of ignore it. They lived in a state, Israel, where misjudgment was possibly catastrophic for the civilization, for Jewish people. And so I think that's one reason they might have been especially kind of attracted to the questions that they were addressing. The other stuff feels to me all very accidental. Very accidental that a person who was such a logician, such a clear theory spinner as Amos, collided with someone who had this welter of insight and ideas about human behavior. And that they were able to kind of, is Percy Diaconis, who is a mathematician, former magician and mathematician and logician at Stanford, who watched these guys work, said it was a miracle that these minds existed in the first place separately, and it was a double miracle that they somehow found a way to collaborate. It took enormous brain power and just serendipity to get at this, but it is a good question. Like, why did it take so long? I don't have a great answer. So.
Mr. Lewis, how did your study of these two men impact your own thinking in life, if at all?
Well, I told you about how I changed how I coached and teached. So that's one example. I give you another example. In a lot of the kind of the ways I've woven some of their thinking into my life is it started even before I wrote the book, when I was kind of getting to know Danny, and so it's been going on a long time, and it's also mixed up with my Moneyball experience. But I think it's true to say that they have caused me, when I am evaluating someone for a job in my life, whether it's my dentist or doctor or lawyer or whoever it is, to tilt against hiring someone who looks the part. That if they look like Marcus Welby or that I don't, there's a reason. The only reason they may be in the role is they look the part, and so I'm very alive. I'm very receptive to people who do not look the part, because the only reason they're in the role is they actually might do it well. And I mean, sort of, but this, as I said, it bleeds into Moneyball, because I do remember Billy Beane's reaction, the Oakland A's general manager's reaction to what he had learned evaluating baseball players, and how the ones that looked the part were often not the part, and the ones who didn't look the part were where the bargains were. Is when he invested his stock in the stock market, he first looked to see what the CEO of the company looked like, because the old stat was like 60% of the CEOs of Fortune 500 companies are white men who are 6'1" or taller. So he would only invest in companies that had something other than a white man who was 6'1" or taller, and because maybe they were just there because they looked the part of the CEO. So that's another kind of example. And the bigger answer to this question is what I hoped to do for the reader, because you can get all these ideas out of academic papers. Some of them, not all of them, but some of them from Danny's book. That the actual nuggets, their ideas that they got across, is one thing. As I lived with these characters and read their stuff and read their private papers and marinated in their lives, they imprinted themselves on me. I have a little homunculus, two little homunculi in my head, Danny and Amos, and I look at the world sometimes and I think, what would Danny think of this, or what would Amos think of this? And I wanted the reader. That's what I wanted the reader to get, in addition to the story that I loved. I wanted the reader to be able to kind of imagine what these really interesting minds would say about a given situation. And so that they're with me. That's the big thing. They're kind of with me all the time.
I have not read your book yet, but it seems to me, listening to this, that the Black Lives Matter movement is really a logical extension of this thinking, of this unconscious bias that all of us have, that we need, just as they did, we need to call it out and be able to talk about it. And I wonder if you've given it that frame, or how you would respond to that.
It's absolutely true that if you accept that people kind of think in stereotypes naturally, even if they aren't malicious about it, that's how people think. If you want to reduce the power of the stereotype, you reduce the importance of the classification. So I actually think that the way to go is not to emphasize racial identity or gender identity, that you want to erode the classification in ways. If you were going to use Amos and Danny's thinking to attack these problems, but I hadn't given it that much thought. I saw an article in the paper today about unconscious bias, and I looked at it and I said, oh my God, it comes right out of their work. And it does come out of, that idea does come out of their work. But I'm not sure I'm just thinking what they would say. If they would say, creating strong, like reinforcing racial identity or gender identity is the way to go. I don't know what they'd say. I think they might be suspicious of it. I think they might say what we want to do is like get rid of the classification. And it's funny that, so let me just, for a minute, let me just talk about the way Amos's paper on how people made similarity judgments, how they matched, was it's absolutely revolutionary. That people, the generally received view of how people said that's like that was that they were doing something that was the equivalent. The metaphor was there was kind of a map in the mind, and they were saying, if that's like that, that's closer to that in your mind, in some geographical space. And Amos said, well, that can't be true. That's not what's going on in the mind, because people say the son is like the father, but they don't say the father is like the son. They say that Tel Aviv is like New York, but they don't say New York is like Tel Aviv. They say magenta is a bit like red, but they don't say red is like magenta. They say the number 101 is kind of like 100, but they don't say the number 100 is like a number 101. He said if it's geographical, then like it has to be symmetrical. That if New York is the same is a certain distance from Tel Aviv, then Tel Aviv has to be the same distance from New York, and that's not what's going on. So what he said instead was going on was people crudely feature match, that it's kind of like they notice identifiable features about something, and they match it to some model in their mind of the thing. So, or if you're, so and so that what you want to do is you want to change what people notice about people. That's the big thing. So you get two kids, in his papers, you get two kids who are on a college campus who don't seem to have anything in common. They wouldn't ever look at each other and say we're similar. You move them both to Mongolia and make them, volunteer workers in Mongolia, and they both say, we have so much in common. We're both students at the university. We're both from America. So it's that he said people were matching what people notice about things. And I think in a weird way, what we want to do is get to the point where you're not really noticing race, or you're not really noticing gender. I think that's what they'd say. Now, how you do it is another thing. But they'd say the more you notice it, the more you're going to think in those terms and type. And that's the problem. But I didn't get into this at all in the book because I didn't know where to go with it, and it's not their words, and they weren't the problems they were thinking about. But it does seem to apply, and it's expressed itself in this whole idea of unconscious bias.
What would Danny or Amos say about the power of context? That is, errors are not human errors, but they can be attributed to the systems that were overworked, that were not supported, that they're not attributable to human error, but rather the environment that we're working in.
What they would say, I think, is, they said something about this. Their work leads to, it's called choice architecture. The decision you make can be really hugely affected by the context in which you make the decision, or the way the decision is framed for you, like the decision about whether to operate or not operate on someone who might die on the operating table. And it's led to, the big thing it's led to is default, like the federal government, instead of asking people to check a box if they want to save more, their employees, federal employees, they say check a box if you don't want to save. And just that mere act causes the savings rate to go way, way up. So they were very sensitive to context. That's context. That's it's still, I think, yet another example of a kind of fallibility. If you're going to respond one way, you have to check. If you frame the question one way and another, if you frame the question another way, it's odd. It's a quirk of the human mind. But they were really sensitive to it. Absolutely.
And I wonder if Amos and Tversky and Kahneman really pushed on to look at distortions that happen when people are in groups. specifically things like groupthink. And if you want to talk about the election, be my guest.
So they didn't have much to say. So I'm not going to talk about the election because I think I've already would have annoyed anybody who I've annoyed sufficiently. But the groupthink is not their work. And in fact, it's funny. Danny said to me, one of the problems with us is people are giving us credit for all kinds of stuff we didn't do in addition to the stuff we did do. And it's like they have become a vessel for all, people just assume that all crazy stuff people do that psychologists have found somehow they're responsible for. But groupthink is not them. The groupthink is not them.
We'll take a question all the way in the back. And while she's getting back there, I have a quick question for you. So they wrote all their papers, most of the seminal papers, in the 70s,
Yes.
I believe.
Up until, 69 to 81 or 2.
Yeah, okay, yeah. And Thaler wrote a bit in the 80s, into the 90s.
Yeah.
Behavioral economics, I have my blinders on now, and I just want to make sure I've got this right, but it feels like to me behavioral economics has kind of hit a wall. I don't sense it making progress.
I don't know.
You don't
I think
know,
you
okay.
might be right. I think, what is interesting is that so behavioral economics is just one avenue, one expression of their
right.
work, one way their work was influential. But if you go to another place where they were really influential, psychology, there is a society for the judgment and decision making, and you've got 1,000 professors from all over the world every year getting together to give talks about the way people make judgments and decisions. And you go to that conference, and every paper sounds like it's a wholly owned subsidiary of Kahneman and Tversky. That they are the kind of a trunk of some tree, and the little branches going out,
Right.
but more trees have not grown up.
Right.
And it's curious how much of how it hasn't gone to a next place.
Right.
I think you're right.
Right. Now, I mean, everyone's been expecting it, but it hasn't really, it's like 3D manufacturing, Come on, where is it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Or voice recognition in
Yeah,
your car
yeah,
that
right.
actually understands
Michael,
your voice.
I'm curious about the fact that you had one subject who's alive and one subject that's been who's long dead.
Mm-hmm.
And how did you balance out, make sure that you weren't biased yourself toward Kahneman's story because you could talk to him, but you couldn't talk to Tversky?
So Danny berated me about this early on. He said, one of the reasons I'm reluctant to cooperate with the book is that I'm afraid that I'm going to come out even better than I should because I'm the living one and the one you can talk to. And I was worried going into it that I'd never had a dead subject. All my subjects I could watch and talk to. And so I had a theoretical concern about bringing Amos back to life or how to do it. It turned out to be not a problem at all. In fact, it turned out in a very weird way. Amos was more alive than Danny. Because he was such a vivid, clear signal. He was sending vivid, clear signals from the grave. And there was a reason for it. He knew his own mind so well. He knew his own preferences so well. He knew exactly what he wanted to do, exactly who he wanted to spend time with, exactly what papers he wanted to keep. And he never did anything he didn't want to do. I mean, nothing. I come from a family that is very good at this, not doing anything they don't want to do, and I've never seen anything like this. He would take his wife would go to the movies, they'd go to a movie that maybe they want to see. He would decide in 5 minutes whether this was worth seeing, and if he didn't want to see it, he'd get up, go home, and watch Hill Street Blues and go pick her up afterwards. Graduate students would walk in on him opening his mail, and there were stacks, because everybody wanted Amos's opinion about everything. And Amos would go through it and be just going right into the garbage can unopened. And they say, what are you doing? And he'd say, I have a what can they do to me rule. And if they can't do anything to me, just chuck it. And he told friends that, he had this, if he was in a faculty meeting or a board meeting, he wasn't on any boards, but a faculty meeting or a party, that if by some accident he ended up in one of these things that he didn't want to actually be in, he'd get up and just leave. And he told people that, you shouldn't sit around and worry about either social embarrassment or thinking up an excuse. It's hard to think of an excuse why you want to leave the party early or why you don't want to sit through the faculty meeting. He says, if you just stand up and start walking, the words come to you. And that he was...
That's great.
He, as one of his friends said, decided very early on that people pay a huge price for to avoid minor social embarrassment, and he was not going to pay the price. And so everything he did and said, and every piece of paper he kept was him. It was just like he really cared about it. If he spent time with someone long enough to become their friend, there was something really important about that person. And everybody had such vivid memories of him. Everybody had a model in their mind that everybody who knew him asked when they went through their lives, what would Amos say? So he was so available, and he was so there. And it ceased to be a problem about, like, he was at least as alive as Danny. And the question of balancing the credit, this was the problem, the relationship, this was what busted up the relationship. The world wanted to do this to them. The world wanted to know who did what, and they all thought of Amos as a genius, so they assumed Amos did it all. And they gave Danny very little credit. Economists especially were very dismissive of Danny. There's a great irony in him winning the Nobel Prize in economics. One economist at Harvard told me that our view of that relationship was Danny ran around doing really weird and bizarre things, and Amos made theories about them, and which was not at all how it worked. But I left the matter of like who did what completely unanswered, very not well answered, and I left it to the reader. If they want to pick this apart, they can, but it's kind of beside the point because neither of them did work outside the partnership that was anything as powerful as the work they did together. It felt like a different body of work. So it was clearly a pure collaboration. It was like two minds melding. And so I didn't really have to answer that. What I did have to do a bit is make some judgments about who was responsible for the relationship falling apart, because it was traumatic for both of them. And there were I had shards, I had evidence, I had the letters going back, these agonized letters going back and forth between the two of them. I had notes from Amos's file cabinets. He saved these. It would say, preparation for phone call with Danny. And underneath it would have the 5 things he knew Danny was going to be upset about and his answers to them. But it was like, you saw this marriage dissolving, and there was a kind of he said, she said coming from both parties. I mean, Barbara Tversky, Amos's widow, and Danny. They had 2 different stories, and they overlapped a bit, and I had to parse that some, but in the end I decided what I really wanted to do, that if I did it right, the sort of people who would have been on Danny's side in real life, my readers, would be on Danny's side when they read the book, and the sort of people who would be on Amos' side in real life would be on Amos' side when they read the book. And that's kind of what's happened, that all of my early readers in the book, people in the publishing houses, I can almost predict who's going to say, oh, Amos was an asshole, or who's going to say, God, Danny was neurotic. And people really kind of go one way or the other. That was where I had to kind of make some judgments. But Amos's not being alive didn't make it that much harder.
I assume that the Hebrew University in Jerusalem at that time was very Freudian in the psychology department. And some of the areas of exploration here, the unconscious, frailty, and decision-making, can be attributed to much of Freudian thinking. And I'm wondering if you came across any influence on them in terms of their theory development. And the other thing, how universal are these concepts in terms of culture, gender, age, and things of that kind?
I didn't hear that. I didn't hear the
How these traits, the way people view the world, are they affected by the culture that they live in? Does it vary by?
I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah.
I don't know the answer to that. And they didn't. It's not something they particularly studied.
Yeah.
The department, the environment in which they kind of came of age was really, the academic environment was really odd. Hebrew University in the late 30s, early 40s or late 30s, might have been the early 40s, tried to create a psychology department. They hired a guy from Italy to come and build it. And he and a couple of assistants were massacred in an Arab ambush. And they then didn't have a department, and they never built it. So Danny was self-taught. He didn't have anybody teaching him. And the situation was so strange that he was identified as intellectually gifted, so he didn't go from high school straight to the Army. Instead, he went to university, and then he went to the Army. After spending 3 years reading up on whatever he could grab about psychology, he's in the Army, and he's identified as the best trained psychologist in the Israeli Army, which is why they give him the task of figuring out how to evaluate young Israelis and decide who will be an officer and who will not. And he does Moneyball for the Israeli Army. He creates an algorithm that they use to this day. He and I went to the Israeli Army base, and he's this legend, you know. Actually, it's kind of fun. I'm going to digress here for a second because it's kind of funny. It's in the middle of nowhere, this base, and he and I went to go see what they were doing with his algorithm and how it had changed, if at all. And we get there, and they're like 50 gorgeous young Israeli female soldiers waiting at the gate for us. And I thought, wow, Danny's like, he's got some pull here. These people, he really is famous in Israel. And we walk into the gate, and they all just melt away. And our guide said, there's an Israeli underwear model named Michael Lewis who has these wonderful abs. And they saw Danny Kahneman with Michael Lewis, and they thought, the Nobel Prize-winner is going to bring somebody we really want to see. And they saw me, and they all left. But so Danny is he's self-taught. He's not surrounded by. Freud is in the air everywhere at that point, but it's not like people who are teaching him it. And Amos is the first class at Hebrew University when it reopens the psychology department, and it is just it's his attitude to his professors, and there were some at that point. There were half a dozen of them. He thought most of them weren't worth listening to, and he didn't listen to them. And there was an odd collection of people. There was a guy who had forged his PhD, who hadn't actually studied psychology, who was trying to teach it, who'd come from Scotland. It was a really kind of odd place then. So Amos was not the Amos is way into this. His path in his specialty was it was a process of elimination. He thought the professors didn't have anything to tell him that he was that interested in, and he found a paper written by a guy named Ward Edwards, who was a psychologist he was at Johns Hopkins and at Michigan, arguing that psychologists should participate in the conversation that economists were having about how people made decisions. And it was the birth of the field of decision theory, and Amos saw this paper and said, that's what I want to do. So he was not at all like attracted or interested in Freud's ideas. Danny was more interested in it. Danny will still mention Freud every now and then, but I think Amos had a kind of hostility to much of his own field.
Well, let's thank Michael Lewis. Thank you.
Thank you.